This is Trump on Earth. I'm Reed Frazier.
L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
3 years ago, most of the world's nations signed the Paris Climate Agreement, a pact that basically said everyone was going to do their best to avert a climate catastrophe.
What we do next, how we implement our targets, how we build this agreement, that is what will determine whether we're actually able to address one of the most complex challenges humankind has ever faced.
Well, 3 years have come and gone, and the state of the world's climate politics are much different than they were then. This year's UN climate meetings, called a Council of Parties, or COP, were in Poland. NPR's Rebecca Hersher was there, and she joins us now to talk about the state of the world, I guess. Rebecca, thanks for joining us.
Hi.
So, Rebecca, can you refresh our memories here? What is a COP, and who goes there, and why is it important?
What is a COP? Well, as you said, it's Conference of the Parties. Well, the parties to what? It's the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this is actually the international legal framework under which countries talk to each other about climate change, basically. I think this was my first time going to one of these things. And what struck me immediately is that the UN system is convoluted because of what it's trying to do. Imagine you have almost 200 countries. They all have sovereign governments, and they're trying to talk about nothing less than how to change the global economy from the foundation up. So you need some laws and some rules about how to do that, and this framework is those laws and rules. So it was signed a long time ago, and since then we've had, it's been decades of agreements that have made virtually no progress toward reducing global emissions of greenhouse gases until Paris. That's why we call it the landmark Paris Climate Agreement, or a lot of people do. That's the cliche. But it was landmarked because it was the first time that every single country said, we are going to set a goal for ourselves, for our country. We're going to promise. It's just a series of promises. We're going to promise to reduce greenhouse gases a certain amount that we believe we can attain. And then, so that's the first part. That was a big deal all on its own. But the second part is actually also a big deal, which is, and then we're going to continue to meet and talk about making those promises stronger in the future. So everyone who signed on not only promised to make a promise, but they promised to update that promise in the future, which is obviously really important because, for the example, the U.S. promised to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by about 26% by 2025. Well, that's not going to get us to averting the worst effects of climate change. We being the U.S., would need to reduce its greenhouse gases by a lot more than that over many, many, many years, decades. So we also said we're going to come back and we're going to update those in the future. So this was the latest meeting, and on the table was, what are the rules about how we enforce those promises?
So did anything sort of get decided or accomplished at this meeting? What was the sort of headline of note takeaway?
Depends on who you ask. Yeah, they made a rule book.
That sounds pretty...
Whoop-de-doo.
That
Very
sounds
exciting.
Pretty important, I guess.
It is. It is important. It's both important and technical and, dare I say, slightly boring in its details. But it's a big deal. The Paris Agreement is just a bunch of promises until you have rules that everyone can agree on for how you measure your carbon emissions and how you report those measurements to each other. Not every country is the same. Some countries are really private about their economies, for example. Imagine China. China has a planned economy. Maybe they don't want to tell the U.S. and every other country on Earth lots of details about exactly where their industry is and what kind of fuels that industry is using and how much carbon is being emitted. Maybe they'd rather give a bird's eye view of exactly how much emissions are being reduced over the next decade. Well, these rules say there's a certain amount of granularity, there's a certain amount of technical detail that every country has to use so that we can compare apples to apples, so we can hold each other accountable. It may not sound like a big deal, but that took 2 full weeks of negotiation, often by the highest levels of government, ministers of the environment from different countries sitting in a room, hashing it out, trying to figure out what they could agree on.
Right, and this is a big deal because, the economies of every country really are predicated on, whatever energy system that we have. And so countries can't really just take this lightly and say, oh, yeah, sure, we'll do whatever you guys say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a big deal. Like if your whole economy is based on coal, like this part of Poland is a coal economy. They mine coal there, they burn it for electricity. It's a big deal to shift away from that. You can't just cavalierly say, we'll clean up our air and hope something happens. Because nothing will.
So since Paris, obviously, just to newsflash, we did have an election in the U.S. And President Trump, after he took office, vowed to take the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And he's made it clear that he's been very skeptical of climate science.
Yeah, I don't believe it. No, I don't believe it. And here's the other thing. Right now, we're at the cleanest we've ever been. And that's very important to me. But if we're clean, but every other place on Earth is dirty, that's not so good.
So what did the U.S. delegation do or say at the conference this year?
Well, the U.S. did basically two contradictory things. On one hand, representatives led by an official from the White House, did a side event, which got a lot of press, where they talked about the future of fossil fuels, namely coal and nuclear. Most of it was about coal. The event was basically about how making coal technology release fewer greenhouse gases is an important part of the overall energy mix, global energy mix. And that if you ask the people on the panel, coal is going to be burned all over the world for many years to come, like it or not. And so making it release fewer greenhouse gases, either by capturing those greenhouse gases at the source when it's burned or sequestering them after they're burned, that's going to be a big part of reducing overall greenhouse gas emissions globally. That was not a particularly welcome message at this conference.
We strongly believe that no country should have to sacrifice economic prosperity or energy security in pursuit of environmental sustainability.
This is a conference theoretically about big, bold, global, multilateral agreements to totally transition the world economy away from fossil fuels. So needless to say, a side event hosted by the Trump administration that talks about how great coal was not that popular.
Is this the one where there were hecklers in the audience?
Exactly. So like half the audience, or maybe even more, was made up of a protest group who got up and yelled at the panelists and eventually marched out after disrupting the proceedings. So on one hand, that's what the Trump administration was there doing. And they were joined on the panel by a representative of the Australian government. It's an outlier position, but they are not the only ones taking that position, that fossil fuels have a future in the world energy economy. But the other thing the Trump administration was doing was negotiating the rule book, the same as every other country. Because even though President Trump has said that the U.S. intends to withdraw from the 2015 Paris Agreement, there's a waiting period. Some people call it a cooling off period. And it's designed to protect against exactly this scenario. So you sign a big agreement and then there's an election and the new person doesn't agree with it. Well, there's this cooling off period where the new person can't immediately pull out. So the U.S. is still in the Paris Agreement. And as a result, we had State Department negotiators working on the rule book, working on those rules for how different countries will count their emissions and how different countries will communicate with each other about those emissions. And by all accounts, those negotiators who are career people, have been doing this for decades, were acting in pretty much the same way the U.S. has in past years. They're known for being pretty tough negotiators, for really pushing for transparency, for example, and that was no different this year. So
it was sort of business as usual on the one hand, but kind of the Trump agenda on the other hand.
Exactly, yeah.
So I noticed one other thing that the U.S. did was it joined Kuwait, Russia, and Saudi Arabia to block the adoption of a UN climate change report. What's the response from the rest of the world when the U.S. does this? If the U.S. is not going to be, one of the leaders to push for, bigger reductions in greenhouse gases, who is going to be driving the agenda at these meetings?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. At this meeting, it appeared that the EU, the European Union, was stepping up in some ways, as was China. China has been a really important ally of the U.S., was a very important ally of the U.S. in passing the Paris Agreement in the first place and creating a coalition around that. And China was once again sort of pushing the negotiations this time. That, you know, they're a big deal. Their economy is very, very large. And the EU has seen emissions reductions. They're actually the only entity that signed on to the Paris Agreement that has seen emissions reductions in recent years. In overall, global emissions have been going up, actually. So in that way, they have some moral authority. And at this COP, they were banding together with small island nations and vulnerable nations. These are low-lying or poorer countries that have been feeling the effects of climate change from sea level rise or from stronger storms or from drought and famine. They had created a coalition called the High Ambition Coalition, who were pushing other countries to promise bigger things in the future. So I think the U.S. standing with those other three countries, all major oil producers, you're right. It signaled that the U.S. was on the outskirts, and it created space for these other countries to move in and become, leaders.
In the absence of a federal leadership on climate change, what did you learn about what cities and states are and can be doing about climate?
What I learned is that local governments all over the U.S. are already doing things that have to do with climate change, whether it's adapting to new weather patterns in their areas or dealing with stronger storms or transitioning their own grids to cleaner sources. This has been going on for a long time. And so after the Trump administration signaled that it might not be interested in being part of this international agreement anymore, all of these cities and states and businesses basically created a coalition that's meant to signal to the rest of the world, hey, we're still doing stuff. Whether or not that's part of the Paris Agreement, we, smaller entities, are doing things that are going to reduce U.S. emissions. Now, how big that emissions reduction will be from non-federal government policy remains to be seen. And there are certainly things that the Trump administration could do that would offset those emissions reductions from local sources. So, rolling back regulations on coal-fired power plants or on wellhead methane emissions at the federal level, that's going to release more emissions. So even if cities are reducing their emissions at the local or state level, you may see an increase in U.S. emissions. But the message that these local leaders are trying to send is at least you can work with the U.S. in good faith. Civil society does not think that climate change is a hoax. We do not agree with our president's questioning of the basic science. And so when the U.S., for example, stands up with other countries and fails to welcome this major UN report about the dire state of the global climate, they're saying, these local leaders are saying, no, we do welcome it and we're taking action.
So what have countries committed to do in the next year or so? And beyond that, what are the big looming questions in this, I guess, dialogue or conversation that all these countries are having in the, 2019 and beyond?
In the next year or so, the main thing that countries need to do is their bureaucrats need to go home and they need to create systems, regulations, they need to create laws in some cases, and they need to rally political support for the rules that were just agreed to in Poland. That's the one-year plan. There's another meeting in September 2019 in New York. It's a special meeting. It's a non-COP meeting of all of the same parties, basically, to talk again about climate change. This was convened by the Secretary General, in part to signal how serious this issue is. And then looking ahead after that, the really big issue is just, will countries have the political will to increase those promises? So, as you mentioned, politics have changed since Paris. That's not just in the U.S. Brazil has a new president who may be signaling that he might want to pull out of Paris. China's economy has weakened. Many European leaders are seeing pressure. It's not just France. Germany seeing pressure.
Yeah.
It remains to be seen whether all of these countries that have made all these promises will be able to take those promises and ramp them up, as is absolutely required if we are hoping to avoid the most catastrophic effects of climate change.
Right now, we're facing a man-made disaster of global scale. Our greatest threat in thousands of years, climate change. If we don't take action, the collapse of our civilizations and the extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon. The people have spoken. Leaders of the world, you must lead.
So this was your first COP that you've covered?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a lot.
What was it like to cover it? I just imagine these really like long sessions, people sort of sleep-deprived bureaucrats and journalists kind of in these like not very well ventilated conference rooms. What was it like to be there? Okay.
It's that at the end, but at the beginning, it's a zoo. There's a lot of money to be made off of this economic transition that we're all undertaking. And so there are a lot of people there who are selling something. They want to tell you about whatever it is, their solution to climate change, their little corner of the world. And there are these whole halls full of booths where people are talking about what their country or their city or their company or their investment bank is doing and why it's the best way to proceed. You know, you have major oil-producing countries who are in there next to countries that are literally seeing their island disappear. And there's simultaneously a lot of tension and a lot of question about what exactly the upshot is of this whole exercise. Because at the end of the day, you know, you're in a conference center. Right. And you're coming up with a set of rules that are non-binding. And so I found it there to be some real dissonance between the magnitude of the issues and the reality of what you're doing, which is, you know, basically sitting in a cubicle.
And to that point, I mean, this has not been a great year for news about the actual climate. I mean, we've got these reports, the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which found, you know, we have something like 12 years before climate change really comes down hard on us. The National Climate Assessment came out and had some pretty stark conclusions. I guess my question is, what was the mood of this meeting in light of all this sort of dire pronouncements about climate change?
There was a lot of talk about those assessments and about others. One of the other ones that maybe doesn't come up as much in the public press, but that was definitely present, is something called the emissions gap report that comes out every year. And that basically does a calculation that shows what is the gap between how much we are emitting globally and how much would need to be emitted if we were to be on track to stay below 2 degrees Celsius increase, which is the cap on the Paris Agreement. And that also had some really, you know, the gap has widened significantly. That came up. I mean, people talk about these scientific reports. In the press, sometimes you forget, like we do stories about science and then we do stories about policy and we sometimes keep them separate. But the reports inform the policy for sure at the international level. And I found that the scientific pronouncements were very present in every single conversation.
Right. If you need a because for your first sentence, that is your because clause.
Exactly. Yeah. That and, you know, your neighbor's house fell into the ocean.
Right. Right. Okay. Is there anything that we didn't mention that you think is important to mention?
No, we did it.
We did it.
We did all the stuff.
Rebecca, thanks so much for talking with me.
Thanks. You got me talking.
Yeah, get some...
I have that, like, tired person thing where you don't know how to stop.
Yeah, I hope you're going to get a little break.
Oh, yeah. I'm going away on Friday.
Cool.
I'm done.
Rebecca Hersher covers climate and the environment for NPR. Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. I'm Reed Frazier. If you like our show, please consider supporting us through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth. You can find all our episodes online at trumponearth.org. Trump on Earth is a production of the Allegheny Front, a public radio show covering the environment in Pennsylvania. We're at AlleghenyFront.org. Our producer and digital editor is Andy Cubis. Kathy Nauer is the executive producer. I'm Reed Frazier. Thanks for listening, and happy 2019.